Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar, The Truth About Sales Agility, Separating Fact from Fiction, presented by Sales Pro Central and sponsored by Vantage Point Performance. I'm Tara, the webinar coordinator for Sales Pro Central, and I'm so excited to bring you this event with such a well-earned insight into the powerful research findings on high-performing Agile sales reps, teams, and managers. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Dr. Michelle Vazzana today, and what I'm sure is going to be a genuinely illuminating conversation. Also, we are recording this webinar in case you have to leave early. We're sending that link to the session's landing page in the chat box right now. Up next, I want to thank Vantage Point Performance for sponsoring this webinar and helping us to make all of this happen. Vantage Point Performance trains salespeople to be more fluent and comfortable across different situations needing different sales approaches, and they train sales managers to be better coaches and team leaders with more focus and less stress. Vantage Point can help your sales team understand how your buyers approach the buying process, learn what matters to buyers at each particular stage in the buying journey, curate sales approaches that align with buying factors as well as your organization's KPIs, and teach your sellers how to assess a buying situation. With Vantage Point, you'll equip all your managers and sellers to be situationally fluent and to execute each unique interaction in the buyer's journey like your top performers. To learn more about how Vantage Point can help you, visit www.vantagepointperformance.com. Up next, let's get some technical things out of the way. Please feel free to ask questions during today's event. You can do so by submitting them into the questions panel on the right side of your screen. Great questions make for a great webinar, so don't forget to stick around for our Q&A to get even more insights from Michelle. My wonderful colleague Tori will be fielding your questions today. She'll be happy to help answer anything you might have, so pull up the questions panel, say hello, and let her know that you're listening. Lastly, if you do have any audio issues during today's presentation, you may choose to dial in by phone. You can do so by selecting the More button in the upper right portion of your screen and then selecting the Switch to Phone option. The numbers are on screen now, but Tori can relay them to you at any point if you need them. Up next, today we're going to be hearing from Michelle Vazzana. She is the Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder of Vantage Point Performance. She's a prolific researcher and sought-after speaker on the topic of sales management and sales agility. She's conducted the most extensive research to date on the topic of sales coaching practices and sales agility. She has more than 32 years of successful sales and management experience, and her new book, The Sales Agility Code: Deploy Situational Fluency to Win More Sales, will be available in April of 2023. It'll actually be the first book on this important topic of sales agility. So with that, Michelle, I'm going to step out of the way so you can go ahead and take it from here.
Thanks so much, Tara. I'm thrilled to be with you this afternoon. This is a topic clearly that's near and dear to my heart, and it's really becoming a buzz in the industry as well. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to take this opportunity to really educate the audience on what is sales agility, how do we know, what did we learn by studying high performers, and then ultimately, what does that mean for you as an effective seller or an effective manager or an organizational leader when you want to upskill and enable your sales force. So let's start with this idea of defining agility. So what is it? It's really the ability to adapt behavior. And this is a really important point here because we're going to talk about what agility is and what agility isn't. But when it comes to sales agility, we're really talking about your ability to adapt behavior based on changes in the situation an individual or a seller is facing. So some other terms being kind of bandied about, and I want to kind of bring them all under one umbrella. There's this idea of situational fluency. You've also probably read some recent Gartner research that talks about situational awareness, situational tuning. They're all aspects of this idea of sales agility and situational fluency. And ultimately, what we mean by that, with whatever term you call it, it's the ability of a seller or sales manager to assess and make sense of the situation they're facing, select the optimal path forward amongst multiple paths, execute that path, and continually monitor impact. So how is what I'm doing impacting the person I'm interacting with or the people I'm interacting with? What's changing, what's working, what's not working? So what I'd like to do is I'd like to harken back to a little bit of research that's been done by Gartner for purposes of creating clarity in the marketplace. And Gartner did this research around how salespeople communicate information. And today, I'm communicating information about sales agility. And what Gartner found is that when it comes to buyers and how they consume information, there's just too much of it out there. There's this abundance of information that's available to buyers in today's landscape. And most of that information is highly credible. The problem is a lot of it is conflicting. So buyers have access to lots of information, but if they read one website, it says one thing. If they read another analyst report or something, it says another thing. What is a buyer to believe? So they've got all this information, much of which is conflicting, which makes it difficult for buyers to make trade-offs, between options. And it also dramatically reduces the chances of making a viable sale by up to 66%. So this is really not good news for us as sellers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you some additional information, not only from Gartner research, but how Vantage Point aligns with that Gartner research. Back to the way that sellers communicate information. Gartner found that there's 3 primary ways that sellers communicate. One profile is called the giver. The giver is the type of seller that provides as much information as they think will possibly be helpful for the customer. So whenever the customer requests something, the giver shares probably more information than is even necessary. But the idea of the giver is, well, I don't really know what they're going to want, so let me just give them as much as I can, and then they can sort through it. Another type of information sharer is the teller. And the teller is pretty much the opposite of the giver. The teller decides what they think the buyer should know and really aligns their opinion or their perspective to what they want the buyer to know. And they really whittle it down and only share what they think is important to share with the buyer. The last one is called the sense maker. And the sense maker gets themselves on the buyer's side of the desk and says, what kind of information is this buyer or this buying team likely to encounter? Where are they likely to get that information? What will they have access to? What are they likely to think about it? What are the confusion points? Let me look at it through the buyer's eyes and help them narrow the field of play. And Gartner found that this sense maker, of course, is significantly more effective than either the giver or the teller. So why am I talking about sense making? The reason is because there's so much buzz in the sales enablement industry right now about sales agility. There's some perspectives that are often misleading. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to share with you the different perspectives that are out there, including our research at Vantage Point and how these all reconcile. And that's why this is called Separating Truth from Fiction. So my goal for this session with you today is to help you make sense of sales agility and what that means for your sales force. And I'm going to unpack a pretty extensive research journey in this process. But before we unpack the journey, I'm going to start with the punchline. And the punchline is that over 14 years and many studies, we've identified that there's multiple levels of sales agility across your sales force. And I'm going to unpack each one of these levels. But the patterns that we find for these different levels they're similar. And the patterns are such that there's no one size fits all for either selling or coaching. And if you try to plug a one size fits all into a sales force, it's going to provide barriers versus enablers to your sellers and your sales managers. So the kinds of agility that we've identified at the different levels in the sales force, the first level is what we call organizational agility. And this is where organizational leaders and managers are able to link salesperson activities with organizational results. And when the results change or market conditions change, they can quickly make adjustments to sales execution to make sure that alignment is consistent and relevant. The next level of sales agility that we identified is called situational agility. And this is the idea that different buying groups have different buying situations. and different buying situations require different sales strategies. The final level of sales agility that we've uncovered fairly recently in our research is what we would call foundational agility. And this is about buyer psychology and the buying journey. And this aligns very closely with some very recent Gartner research around the emotional journey that buyers go through when they make a buying decision, the information journey as well as the emotional journey, and how the most effective sellers take a more empathetic approach in dealing with buyers as they navigate that journey. So we'll get into detail about each of these levels of agilities as we navigate this session today. So I'm going to plant a seed that I'm going to get back to a little bit later in our discussion. And I'm going to share with you some common yet possibly misleading perspectives on sales agility that if you haven't heard or been exposed to, you most likely will in the near future, especially if you're interested in the topic of sales agility and you start researching this in the marketplace. So one of the perspectives is that sales agility is about understanding the buyer's position in their buying process and aligning to that. The other perspective that's gaining traction is this idea that sales agility is synonymous with and aligned to Agile software development. And I'm going to unpack each of those positions and where they're true and where they're not. So just kind of keep that in mind, and we're going to get back to that a little bit later in our presentation. So let's start with the research journey. And I'm going to share with you a series of research studies that were conducted by Vantage Point and other organizations and what we learned. So the first set of research studies into sales agility had to do with management and coaching. And the big question is, how does agility impact management, effective sales management and effective coaching? Is there one best way to coach and manage? And our findings on these topics are published in both Cracking the Sales Management Code and Crushing Quota, both by McGraw-Hill. You can find them on Amazon. So how about sales metrics? Is there a best practice around sales metrics? And what we found in one of our initial studies was that, well, there's really not one size fits all for sales metrics either. Which metrics should I be paying attention to and tracking and aligning to? Well, that depends. It depends on which business results you're targeting. Are you looking to improve revenues? Are you looking to gain market share? Are you looking to impact customer satisfaction? So depending upon which result you're targeting, the objectives or KPIs that you align to would change. So based on the results you want, specific objectives and KPIs are most well aligned to those results. And ultimately, the activities that you want your sellers executing have to be aligned to those objectives and results. Not only aligned, but executed consistently well. So although there's not one size fits all, there's a pattern that high-performing leaders use to ensure that salesperson execution is aligned with organizational goals and objectives. So no one size fits all as it relates to sales metrics. Then we did some very deep analysis and research around sales coaching practices. So we know that aligning results to objectives and activities is critical, but then how do high-performing managers coach in ways that help them move the needle more readily than average or low-performing managers? And to do this, we did several studies. One of them was an analysis of the three primary types of coaching that are trained within the industry. Capability coaching, which is often aligned with competency models, generic leadership programs, think situational leadership, think the GROW model. So we examined coaching to capabilities, we examined coaching to results, think pipeline scrubbing, forecasting, and then coaching to sales activities. So we had some hypotheses going into this research, and we thought certainly coaching to capabilities would be one of the strongest and most closely aligned to quota attainment. But we were wrong. It turns out that when managers coach to individual capabilities like open-ended questions, objection handling, that sort of thing, in isolation, without connecting it to deals and opportunities, things like that, it doesn't really move a needle. It was barely even noticeable, certainly not statistically significant. It only accounted for 2% of variance in quota attainment. We looked at coaching to results. Well, that amounted to about 10% of variance in quota attainment, but it still didn't even come close to reaching statistical significance. The only type of coaching that was meaningfully, positively, and significantly related to quota attainment was coaching to activities. And managers that coach to activities outperform managers that don't by a large margin. So coaching to activities really is sort of where the magic is when it comes to ensuring that coaching has the desired outcomes. So what we learned by doing all of these studies into sales metrics, sales coaching practices, sales coaching topics, is that managers that are the most agile and that ensure field level execution aligns with organizational goals, they do the following things. They ensure that activities align with results. They coach to those highest impact critical activities. They can't coach everything, so they narrow down what they coach to those things that matter most, and they do it in a formal, structured way. They also monitor leading indicators, which metrics matter, which metrics am I looking to move to determine, am I making, is my team, are the individuals on my team making the desired progress on the right things in the right direction, whether that's improved close rates, whether that's better opportunity qualification, whether that's shorter selling cycles. Those specific KPIs are determined ahead of time and tracked to determine, are we making progress? If so, fantastic. If not, we need to make adjustments, either to the activities sellers are executing or the coaching that managers are providing. So that's a decision-making framework that the highest performing managers use to ensure organizational alignment between field execution and organizational goals. So we're going to shift gears now, and we're going to move to the research that informed that middle level of sales agility that we call situational sales agility. And these research studies originated at the Florida State University Sales Institute. And the reason they conducted these research studies is there was a research consortium that's made up of over 40 companies that's part of this consortium at FSU. And they always have a burning question for the following year that the FSU team can go and research. And at this one point, this was when Challenger had become all the rage. And the leaders within that consortium wanted to know, is there one best sales methodology? And if so, is it Challenger? And is Challenger really a thing? They also wanted to know, do high-performing sellers, are they more adaptable than their peers, than the rest of the organization? And if so, how? And if they do adapt, does that actually improve win rates? So there was a series of studies designed to identify whether there was a methodology, whether Challenger was a thing, and how that actually manifested within the sales force. And their findings were really interesting, and they were also validated by Vantage Point over the last 4 years. So one of the findings, which was pretty interesting, was that each sales force faces between 4 and 6 unique buying situations. And they're meaningfully different even from other organizations that are in their same industry. The most typical number is 4, but it can be anywhere from really 3 to 6. So each seller within a sales force faces between 4 and 6 unique buying situations. High-performing sellers also display 4 patterns of selling behavior, not just 1. And high performers choose different sales strategies based on the situation they face, whereas core and low performers use the same approach regardless of the situation they face. So before we move on, let's think about the implications of that statement, that last statement. A lot of organizations deploy sales methodologies in order to drive standardization across the sales force. They choose spin selling, or they choose some other form of consultative selling. And they do this to ensure that each seller is executing in a way that's going to drive the best outcomes. And this research identified that the only people that are going to follow your one-size-fits-all sales methodology are your average performers. So if you launch a one-size-fits-all strategy, no matter what it is, you're basically training your sales force to be average. Not only is that kind of a scary conclusion, but some more recent research by Gartner identified that organizations tie the hands of their sellers by trying too hard to drive standardization. And standardization is necessary, but it only works if you standardize the right things. So part of what we're going to talk about today is, what are the things that really benefit from standardization? And a sales approach certainly benefits from some standardization, but if that standardization really narrows the focus of what you equip and enable your sellers to do, you're probably tying their hands in ways that actually dramatically reduce the numbers of your sellers that are going to make it to quota. So we validated this research that was done by FSU, but in the meantime, additional questions came up. And we wanted to know all these buying factors that the FSU team studied. There was over 27 of them. How do they work together? Are there patterns in those buying factors that can help sellers make sense of them and actually use them to execute more agile approaches with their buyers? So when you think about all the things that sellers need to know in a buying situation, it really is a little bit overwhelming. So we went back and we analyzed over 4,000 deals to identify not only the buying factors, but are there trends or patterns within those buying factors that can make this more consumable and executable for sellers. And what we found is there was actually patterns within these buying factors. First of all, we were able to reduce the overall number, taking some noise out of the system. But then we identified 5 discrete categories of buying factors that work together, and that if sellers can understand and make sense of these 5 buying factor categories, they can get a pretty accurate picture of the buying situation. So we ultimately landed on a decision-making framework for sales agility, where the highest performing sellers, they assess the factors within that buying situation to get an accurate read on what they're facing. They choose from amongst multiple selling strategies, not just one. They execute the tactics within that strategy, and then they're constantly monitoring buyer reactions and feedback for changes in the buying situation. So this is not a one and done thing. These really highly effective sellers are constantly assessing their buying situation, attending to changes in that situation, selecting and adjusting approaches and tactics as necessary to align to that buying situation. So all of these findings culminated in this middle level of agility that we call situational agility. And that's really all about assessing the buying situation, choosing the right approach, executing that approach, and monitoring buyer reaction. But as researchers, and if there's any one of you in the audience that are researchers, you know that when you do research, oftentimes you don't get what you think you're going to find, and it raises even more questions. And that's what happened in the sales agility research. We had additional questions. So we wanted to know not only how do these buying factors work together, but then how do these 4 sales strategies align or work together? Are they really as discrete as we initially believed, or are there nuances and issues in executing these strategies that we need to know about in order to be able to help sellers be more agile? So let's go back to one of my prior points. One of the common yet inadequate perspectives on sales agility is that situational fluency is about flexing to the buyer's position in their buying journey. The good news is this is actually true. This is not misleading. It's true. It's just incomplete. So we did find, when we studied all these buying factors, that only one of these over 27 buying factors was significant in every buying situation that we studied in over 4,000 deals. And that was stage of the buying journey. So the steps or stages a buyer or buying team goes through when they make a purchase decision, especially a major purchase decision, are critically important to understanding the buying situation. So this one factor was significant in all buying situations. So when we say that stage of the buying journey was important, yes, it is. Our research confirmed that, but it's also not the end of the story. It's only, buying stage is only one factor among many that impact the buying situation. So we looked very closely at buying stage, and we realized it had an outsized impact on the nature of the buying situation and the seller's understanding of that buying situation. So we also asked another question. How do these 4 selling strategies, consultative selling, disruptive or challenging selling, competitive or product-focused selling, and finally financial or more of an ROI-driven approach, are they really 4 discrete patterns, or do they work together in ways that were not obvious? And again, we analyzed over 4,000 deals and the tactics that sellers used when they pursue those deals, and then which resulted in wins versus which didn't. And what we found is that they're not necessarily four discrete strategies. Consultative selling, the tactics within consultative selling were used highly in every single deal, regardless of the primary strategy selected. So for example, if a competitive strategy was the primary strategy the seller reported, there was still a high use of consultative selling in addition to the competitive tactics. And that was true across all of these strategies. So instead of four absolutely discrete strategies, consultative selling seems to be a sort of a foundational piece and provides a pivoting off point for sellers that realize as they're pursuing an opportunity, wow, I need to shift to a disruptive approach or a competitive or a financial approach based on changes or nuances in this buying situation. We also know that buying stage is critical. It's a foundational factor. And we know that when sellers engage early in the buyer's journey, their use of consultative tactics is 6 times higher than if they engage later in the buying journey. So not only is consultative foundational, but it's also very heavily front-loaded in the buyer's journey, whether the seller is involved or not, right? So the typical discovery that happens in a consultative selling approach is now being done primarily by the buyer and the buying team, not necessarily with the use of a seller, right? They're often doing this work on their own. In fact, there's a lot of data that would suggest that by the time a seller gets involved in an opportunity, the buyer is 60% or more down the path of their buying journey, which really changes the nature of how sellers can interact with and align to their buyers. So, of course, as researchers, we have additional questions about consultative selling. So we said, okay, of the 3 primary tactics involved in a consultative sales strategy, which tactics are most closely correlated to wins, to positive outcomes? And again, we had a hypothesis, and our hypothesis was that uncovering needs would be significantly more strongly correlated to wins than the other 2 tactics. And guess what? We were wrong. Obtaining commitment was by far the most powerful predictor of wins. And not only obtaining commitment, but obtaining incremental commitment along the buying journey. So those sellers that obtained incremental commitments all along the way as they navigated that buying journey with the buying team were much more likely to win versus sellers that did not. So again, when you do research, you have to be willing to be wrong. You have to be willing to get information you didn't anticipate and dig a little deeper, right? So what happens oftentimes with research is we share the results and then people say, well, duh, that makes sense. Well, sure, it makes sense once you know the answer, but lots of things make sense once you know the answer. The challenge is in getting to those answers and analyzing those answers so you actually know what the implications are for salesperson effectiveness. So obtaining commitment matters. It matters a lot. So in conclusion, buying stage is foundational to sales agility, and consultative selling is foundational to sales agility. And if you have a consultative selling approach embedded in your organization, fantastic. Just make sure that that consultative selling approach really does address the buying journey, the emotional aspects of that buying journey, and then how sales behavior needs to align with that buying journey in order to drive the best outcomes. So lots of really good information regarding sales agility. This last piece, this decision-making framework around foundational agility, is where the most effective sellers assess the buyer's journey and their location within that journey, choose the best approach, whether it's a pain first or gain first approach, ensuring the seller's objectives align with the buyers. They execute the tactics within that individual interaction, and they monitor buyer reactions and continuous changes in buyer behavior. So that forms that final element of sales agility, which is foundational agility. Now, it's highly likely that as we continue this research, we will find new and very interesting things about sales agility. But 14 years later and many studies later, these 3 levels are what we've discovered. So I'm going to return just a quick summary. We have organizational agility, ensuring that salesperson field level activity aligns with organizational outcomes. Situational agility, ensuring that different buying situations require different strategies and continuing monitoring. And then foundational agility, which is all about really deeply understanding buyer psychology and the buying journey, adapting the sales approach according to the buying journey, executing that approach, and monitoring buyer reactions. So these three levels are alive and well within your sales force. So back to one of our possibly misleading perspectives on sales agility, and that is that sales agility is similar to and benefits from principles of agile software development. There's actually several books on this topic right now that attempt to align selling with agile software development. And there's some fundamental flaws with the reasoning, and I want to point those out. It's always tempting when there's a really popular methodology out there in the industry, and we can borrow from one industry or domain and plug it into another domain. It's always very tempting. However, it really benefits from really digging under the hood and understanding what is this methodology we're talking about, where does it align and where does it not align. So when we think about agile software development, the most popular methodology for agile software development is called SCRUM. And SCRUM involves a series of what's called sprints. And those are short development cycles, and they're conducted by individual developers on a development team. And individual developers are doing development in isolation, but concurrently with other developers. And so these agile sprints, they're tiny pieces of code, which represent tiny portions of an overall project. Different developers, they're sprinting concurrently on different topics. Now, this works really well for software development, even product development. But in sales agility, we're talking about human behavior. We're talking about psychology. We're talking about a very malleable and very largely unpredictable set of behaviors with buyers and the implications of those for sellers. So one of the biggest differences between agile software development and agile selling is that agile software development is internal to the developer's environment. They have complete control over that environment. Agile selling is external to the seller's environment. They're dealing with the external world, buying teams, market insights, analyst reports. There's all of this information that is external to the seller's organization. So when you think about the high control environment of agile software development and the low control environment of salesperson agility, you can see that there's some disconnects. Now, it's very clever to tie selling to agile software development, but you could also tie selling to Six Sigma. There's probably elements within Six Sigma that are similar. But if you take the overall methodology and try to fit, there's some inconsistencies that really don't work that well. So while it's clever, it's not necessarily accurate. So we want to move away from this description of what is sales agility and what is it not. So we've cleared up some of the most common sort of frameworks and how they fit or don't fit. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to talk about how do you actually train and master sales agility. And the idea of taking an idea from one domain and applying it to another is actually quite a good idea as long as it fits. Now, I mentioned when it comes to sales agility, we're not talking about product development. We're talking about human behavior and influencing human behavior. And so when the researchers initially identified that the highest performing salespeople are more adaptable and agile, they looked across the industry to see who's actually teaching sales agility. And at that time, there were no sales training companies teaching sales agility. So the researchers had to look at other domains outside of selling where they train agility into the job. So they looked to the military, they looked at professional sports teams, they looked at first responders, and they said, every single one of these domains requires agility. And individuals in these domains have to learn agility so that they can do their job effectively, right? When you're a fighter pilot, you don't have a lot of time to think, right? When you're the quarterback and someone snaps the ball, you've got, probably about 30 seconds to think before you're going to be sacked, right? So this idea of agility is alive and well in other domains. And we had to look outside of sales to determine what are the pillars of agility that other domains use to train agility into the job. And what the researchers learned is that there's actually three core pillars that drive agility. And we'll use a military example. If you want an Agile fighter pilot, you have to teach them really three things. One of them is situational intelligence, then there's situational readiness, and then there's situational fluency. Those things are also true for first responders. They're also true for professional athletes. They're also true for high-performing sellers. So in situational intelligence, we're giving fighter pilots the ability to assess the situation. And this is called data on previous engagements. And fighter pilots actually keep logs they call dope logs. And this is where they learn from each situation they face so that they can apply that learning to future situations. Situational readiness for a fighter pilot is where they go into the simulations and they learn what's the best standard operating procedure when I face this kind of situation, and then they simulate the execution of that path. And then situational fluency is being able to do that without thinking too much about it, being able to do it as from muscle memory. And then, of course, monitoring the reaction and course correcting. So this idea of situational intelligence, situational readiness, and situational fluency not only work for fighter pilots, but it also works for sales managers driving organizational agility, high-performing sellers who recognize buying situations and select multiple different sales paths and then execute the right one, and foundational agility, where we have to assess the buying situation, select the right approach, execute that approach, and monitor reactions. Each one of the steps in these frameworks are about situational intelligence, situational readiness, and situational fluency. So what happens when these different sorts of agility are actually executed within the sales force? Well, we see things like significantly more sellers at quota. We see things like dramatic revenue enhancement. We see things like improved average selling price. These are just samplings of metrics that we see, and we see many more across clients in our work. So if you want to learn more about this, there's a couple things you can do. You can request our white paper called The Bottom Line on Sales Agility, Separating Fact from Fiction. This gives a much deeper dive into the research journey that we went on in order to identify these findings. And you can also get on the waiting list for the Sales Agility Code. This is being published by McGraw-Hill in the spring of 2023. Some actions you can take, the key takeaways. Agile software development does not equal sales agility. It's clever. There are some things that align, but there's many that don't. The buying journey is a piece of the sales agility puzzle, not the entire puzzle. Consultative selling, not only is it not dead, but it's foundational to other forms of agility. If you don't have a good baseline understanding of consultative selling, you'd have a hard time pivoting to another strategy. And finally, agility can be trained, but understand where that training came from. You know, peek under the hood, understand the genesis of whatever framework you're getting ready to execute, and make sure that it actually is based on research of high performers in your space. So actions you can take. You can read our white paper. You can request it at info@vantagepointperformance.com. You can watch a video about organizational alignment and crushing quota. And you can also contact me if you have additional questions or want to chat a little bit more about sales agility. So Tara, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Wow, Michelle, thank you so much for that. What valuable information. I just learned so much. Before we do dive into questions, I want to remind everyone that now is the time to get straight from the source insight from Michelle. Great questions make for a great webinar, so don't forget to submit yours. Lastly, we understand if you need to run, just know that today's session is being recorded and will be emailed to you within the next 48 hours. If we don't get to your question today, you can always connect with Michelle via her social media and the other resources she's mentioned. Now, with our remaining time, let's go over some audience questions. I have one coming in from David. And he's asking, what do you think about enhancing agility in a virtual selling environment?
Oh, good question. Well, that's what we're all doing now anyway, right? Most of us are selling virtually. The same principles apply, right? You still have to assess the buying situation. You have to assess the different individuals involved in the buying situation and the buying factors. It's just a little more challenging now. It's more challenging on multiple levels. You can see people on Zoom or any of the other platforms. However, there's a lot that you can't read, right? So you may get some visual cues, but you don't get as many as you would if you were face-to-face. So it is a little bit more challenging, but the same fundamental concepts apply. You have to assess the buying situation. You have to understand the buying factors. You have to understand what sources of information your buyers are likely to have access to, where they're likely to get their opinions shaped. So whether it's virtual, whether it's in person, the same fundamental dynamics apply. It's just a little more challenging. Now, on the flip side of that, there is a big benefit to that, because when in face-to-face selling, you really can't record your calls, right? It's a little weird. You can't ask your buyer face-to-face, do you mind if I just hit record on my phone? It just sounds weird. But when you're selling in virtual platforms, many of those calls can be recorded, and people are getting more and more used to having calls recorded. So one of the big differentiators between high-performing sellers and everyone else is they go back and they review their sales calls. They review their selling approach, their buyer reactions, what worked, what didn't work, so that they can continuously improve moving forward. That is an element of virtual selling that's actually helping sellers be more effective, because they have immediate feedback and data points that they can access versus just memory of what happened during a call. So that's all I have to say on that, Tara.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. And if there are any follow-ups to these points here, please feel free to go ahead and drop those in the chat. The next question is coming in from Kenneth. He would love it if you could expand a bit on flexing to the buyer's position in the buyer's journey.
Okay, great. So you might want to also request our white paper. Just info at vantagepointperformance.com. We'll send that to you. We get in very deep detail about that, not only in our white paper, but in our upcoming book. In the buying journey, it's based on decision science. And what's the science of how people make decisions? And a lot of this research stems from psychology, psychological research, and behavioral economics. And we know that early in a buyer's journey, there's this sort of pivot point of, is my problem big enough to fix? And buyers are change resistant. So unless there's a problem with the status quo or some kind of pain that's making their lives miserable, it's unlikely they're going to make a change. Very few buyers make a change just to make things a little bit better. Usually there's a problem that they're looking to solve. And a lot of times when you look at stalled deals, it's because the buyer really didn't make that decision. Is it a go or no go, right? They never got past that, should I change or not change? Once a buyer decides, I'm actually going to do something different. I'm going to look at different ways of solving this problem. All of the elements or attributes of that buying journey change significantly. They shift from thinking about problems and downsides to thinking more aspirationally about what do they want, why do they want it, what criteria are most important, which criteria are less important, and then they use that information to evaluate options in the marketplace. And then as they evaluate options in the marketplace, those criteria, they change oftentimes as they navigate additional solutions and they gain information about different solutions. That criteria continues to flex and change. And once they evaluate the options available, they then narrow that down typically to a vital few, and then they look to reduce their risk. So let's say they narrow it down to you and one of your competitors, and you're in some bake-off situation. They not only want to know, how do you solve my problems and how do you make my life better, but how can I ensure that you're the right partner and you're not going to make me look bad? There's some recent research that's been published in a book called The Jolt Effect that said buyers are more scared of making a bad choice than they are in making no choice. So there's this idea of mitigating risk later in their buying journey. And as buying decisions become more and more public within the organization, with more just more exposure, buyers have a much keener sense of risk and want to avoid that risk. So you go all the way from problem identification, criteria development, solution evaluation, risk mitigation to decision, and then implementation. And buyers' behavior, buyer objectives, buyer goals and motivations change at each step along that journey. I hope that was helpful.
Michelle, it absolutely was. And following up with that, Kenneth also said yes. He said, how do you get a buyer to move after 6 years and 3 RFPs where they stayed with current status and supply?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, my question would be, why is the RFP being issued? So if the RFP is being issued just as a way to tick the corporate box, and where they really just want to stick with their current supplier, if you've had evidence that the last 3 RFPs have not resulted in a change, then they're probably just doing that to check the box that says, all right, purchasing, I looked at different alternatives, and yes, our current incumbent is the best supplier. And those are the kind of questions that we always ask if we're going to even be involved in RFP. If there's an existing incumbent that's part of this process, we will often just walk away. And we do a very deep analysis early in that process to see, is this really a viable, winnable deal? And in many cases, the answer is no. So as a seller, I would suggest that get very deliberate and very selective as to not only which RFPs that you get involved in, but how you evaluate the viability of your chances of a win within that RFP. If the buying group is not willing to share who else they're looking at, if they're not willing to agree to a post-mortem if you lose, there's some criteria that we use that says if buyers are not willing to say yes to those things, they've already decided who they want to go with, and it's probably not you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, Kenneth, for such great questions. And again, feel free to throw a follow-up in the chat if you have one. Our next question actually seems to kind of spin off of that. It's coming in from Dina. She's wondering if you have any strategies or tips on building rapport, especially virtually, with your buyers, and a little bit more insight into how to understand more about the buyer psychology.
Yeah. So one of our salespeople, her name is Barbara Dew, she's phenomenal. She does a significant amount of research on the client before she gets on her first call with the client. She listens to their earning calls. She scours their LinkedIn accounts to find out where do they go to school, what kinds of jobs have they had. On the earning calls, what are the main initiatives going on in the organization? And she uses that information very early in the first conversation to not only build rapport, but establish credibility with the buyer. So the traditional ways of building rapport are really getting to know someone almost on a personal level. Buyers are a lot less inclined to want to do that in a virtual environment, at least we have found. And so the initial way to build rapport is just to focus on the buyer themselves, what you've learned about the buyer, what you've learned about the buyer's organization. And once you use that information to build credibility, then you actually earn the right to ask about the picture that's behind them on the wall, or their dog who just ran up and barked during the sales call. So it's kind of flipped. It used to be, let's talk about personal stuff first and get to business stuff. Now it seems like we're talking about business stuff and then transitioning to personal stuff if we've earned the right. From a psychology perspective, what that does is it establishes trust. The way that it establishes trust is because you've shown that you're willing to spend the time getting to know the buyer and the buyer's organization before you get on the line with them. And when they trust you, they're more likely to open up to you. So psychology says, if I'm a buyer and I think you're trying to influence, I'm going to be inherently resistant. If I'm a buyer and I think you're very interested in me and you've taken the time to get to know about me before you even get on the line with me, that says something differently entirely. And now you've earned the right to learn about me. So that's kind of how I would talk about those two topics.
Really, really interesting, Michelle. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me see here. We do have time for a couple more. This question is coming in from Lisa. Let me just see if I can clarify a bit here. She's saying she is a new sales manager. She's looking to know more about how she can implement the situational sales agility and these processes and procedures as far as her being a manager and getting these skills to her team.
Sure. Well, it'd be kind of hard as a manager to train your salespeople in all these things. Here's what I recommend initially. If you haven't had any sales manager training and your organization is not of a certain size, you might want to consider buying Crushing Quota. It's basically an operating manual for how to be a good sales manager. And that will teach you the organizational agility piece. With regard to situational sales agility, if you check out our website, vantagepointperformance.com, there's some information on there about the different programs that we offer. The one on situational sales agility, it's called the Sales Agility Code Situational, and there's the Sales Agility Code Foundational. I think it really depends upon the skill set and starting point for your sales team. If they've got a really good, strong handle on consultative selling and they understand buyer psychology, you can probably jump right to situational agility. If they don't, you might want to start with a more foundational approach. But if you go to our website, we've got very clear descriptions, not only of each of these programs, but what engagements look like. And if you want to chat with one of us, just drop us an email. We'd be happy to have a conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. And again, any follow-ups, please go ahead and get those in. Next question is coming in from Carrie. She is wondering if you have any strategies as far as influencing our C-level executives to make changes in our sales training and agility training. They seem to be stuck in their ways.
Oh, it's so true. There are some methodologies that have been around for like 60 years that are still being trained, and they haven't been updated. They're not based on recent research, and it's really sad. And what happens is, as a sales, let's say I'm a sales manager and I learned, let's say SPIN or some other methodology 30 years ago, and it really worked for me and my sales team. I become a sales leader, and since that worked for me 30 years ago, I want everybody to get that. I would suggest that you get this research in the hands of your organizational leaders. And the best way to do that, we've got a series of videos on our website. You can take a look, you can choose one, you can send a link to that to one of your leaders. You can get our white paper, you can socialize that with some of your leaders. The reason they keep going back to the same old things is because they don't know what else is available. They don't know what the alternatives are. And sales leaders are on the hot seat, right? They're always trying to achieve quotas that are almost unattainable, right? They've got a million things on their plate. They don't necessarily research this stuff. So if you really want to change the minds and hearts of your highest level leaders in your organization, get the research in front of them. They could listen to this webinar. They could read the white paper. They could watch a few of the short videos on our website. Those are the things that I would probably do.
Yeah, yep, that makes complete sense. Thanks, Carrie, for that question. Let's see, we have one more coming in from Mike. He's wondering if there are any specific pitfalls you've noticed with adopting this kind of sales strategy.
Yes, there are. What happens when people learn sales agility and they learn these 4 patterns of behavior? The one that's the most comfortable for them tends to be the consultative approach. They may have also gotten training on Challenger. So if they've gotten training on Challenger, then the disruptive is their favorite approach. The pitfall is to get really comfortable with one approach and use that approach consistently. So it's this trap of, I'm going to use what I know, I'm going to use what I like. And the best salespeople, they don't have sacred cows. They know that consultative works in certain situations, disruptive works in other situations. So it's the ability to suspend judgment and to move away from predetermined behaviors and be more open and flexible in the approach. Don't get too attached to one tactic or one strategy, because each strategy is only effective about 25 to 30% of the time.
Interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. Look, I think we have time for one more here. Coming in from Catherine, I think this is a good one to kind of close with. How can I continue to keep myself informed with new research about these things?
Well, one of the ways you can do it is you can Google it, all right? Sales agility research. I would pay attention to Forrester and Gartner as well. They're both excellent organizations doing significant research into agility. I've seen a little bit more on agility from Gartner recently, but both Forrester and Gartner are very credible organizations that provide research on selling and buying that can help you stay ahead of what's happening in the marketplace. And if you're working with an organization, a sales training or enablement company, and they're not aware of that research and they can't tell you how they align to that research, that should kind of raise some red flags for you. because just as your organization should be aware of what's happening from a sales enablement perspective, I need to be aware of what's happening with the analysts and whether their research aligns with our research, and if there's disconnects, where are they and why, right? So it's the ability to, it's the desire to get sort of beyond your own little comfort zone and pay attention to what the smartest people in the space are saying about this research. And I would start with Gartner and Forrester.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm going to call it there. That's all we have time for today. I hope you all learned half as much as I did. Thank you again to our sponsor, Vantage Point. Michelle, a big special thank you to you for, such a phenomenal session and such valuable insights here in our Q&A.
Thanks, everyone.
Another big thank you to everyone who is here with us today. I hope you all have a great rest of your day and have a great weekend coming up.